Welcome to the Dolby Music Community Sessions. I'm Ben Givers with Dolby Laboratories based in Los Angeles. And in this month's session, I am so excited to welcome back mix engineer Nick Reeves to the community sessions. Nick has mixed the likes of Bob Marley, Billie Eilish, Pearl Jam, REM, to name just a few. He's the director of audio engineering for Universal Music Group. He also spent 10 years at the legendary Capitol Studios here in Los Angeles. He's been so gracious to join Dolby in the past at events such as NAMM and South by, and today he's going to share some of his QC tips and some critical pieces to consider when preparing your Dolby Atmos albums and tracks for delivery. Nick will share how he uses different types of filters on your LFE sends to affect specific frequencies in your mix to really ensure that low-end translation, something we've been talking about on previous sessions, and even what to think about when managing LFE for specific and different types of music. So he's also going to share how and why we manage integrated loudness and true peak in tracks in Dolby Atmos and albums to make sure that they perform correctly and translate with intent out into the world. It is always truly an honor to have Nick join us. You're not going to want to miss this one. Also, Dolby's Greg Stryke Chin is back as always with his pro mix tips. And this one features a favorite of mine personally, and that is the Dolby Atmos Music Panner plugin. Greg's going to demonstrate how to write automation using the Music Panner and bring that into Pro Tools to control the Pro Tools native panner. So many of you, we know, love using the Dolby Atmos Music Panner step sequencer and its various modes. And Greg's going to show you how to bring that automation over to Pro Tools, which will hopefully give you some ideas for some increased flexibility and some musicality in your workflow with the Music Panner and inside Pro Tools. So, of course, Nick and Greg will both be here to answer your questions. Please add them into the questions function and please type your name along with your question so we can be sure to address you when we answer. In our last music community session, Dolby's Emma Brooks hosted a great conversation with Gavin Haverstick of Haverstick Design and Josh Eastock of Focal, where they went deep into best practices and tips for room design and layout. Emma also shared some of the new features of the Dolby Atmos room design tool, also called the DART, and we highlighted a great in-depth tutorial video with Dolby's David Ziegler, which you can check out at the Dolby YouTube channel now. And just following that, we have just released a new 3-part video series on the DART, which is in shorter 2 to 3 minute video pieces. So if you want to get going with the DART tool and you need a quick start, this is a great way to go through both basic and advanced features. So huge shout out to Bennett and his team for their great videos. This is another great one from that team. Check out the Dolby YouTube channel and our pro site, professional.dolby.com, for that. The Pro site is also where you'll find the latest Dolby Tools updates and downloads, such as the Dolby Atmos Renderer, Dolby Atmos Album Assembler. Bennett also has done some quick start videos for those, which are there, plus links to the Dolby Atmos Music Knowledge Base, along with our forum and FAQs, where, of course, you can ask your questions and interact with the Dolby community and our support teams. That is a great resource. Also, our studio's onboarding page and our studio's best practices guides are found there as well. These are great resources for your studio in really any phase of enablement for Dolby Atmos. So scan the QR code on the screen now to opt into our creators database, and that will get you the latest tools updates and tutorials, invites to the community sessions and event notices. We're always super active out there in the world. Just scroll down to the bottom of the page for the sign-up form, enter your information, and away you go. You can also email musicrelations@dolby.com if you have any questions or comments, or you want to connect with our Dolby Industry Relations team, also known as the Music Partnerships team. Be sure to also check out the Dolby Institute page with the free Dolby Atmos Essentials course, which covers all the topics you need to get started creating and mixing Dolby Atmos music. That course is great. It's available in 5 languages and it covers various workflows for using the Dolby Atmos Renderer and various DAWs. There's both post-production and Atmos music exercises there, along with some great demo content. Again, it's a completely free, full course, so don't miss that great resource as well. Dolby's Institute page is also where you can find the deep dive workflow tutorial videos, which take you from room setup all the way through to delivery, including headphone and speaker-based workflows. There's also a great series of tutorial videos in Spanish with mix engineer Luis Del Toro. And you can also check out the latest on the Dolby Music Accelerator and the John Lennon Educational Tour Bus programs, which we touched on a little bit in our last session and are going to do some more on coming up soon, plus a ton of other great resources and events at dolby.com/institute. You can check out an archive of all of our previous community sessions at our YouTube channel and pro site, and that includes deep dives on studios with Emma Brooks, room tuning with Brian Pennington, deep dives on the renderer and album assembler with Jordan Glasgow and Finn Barnes, and there are tons of sessions with top mix and mastering engineers from around the world. That's also where we'll post this session so you can watch the replay or send links of the recording to friends. All right, so again, in this month's session, we will be going deep with Nick Reeves on QC, and that is coming up right after Greg Stryke Chin's Pro Mix Tips. Please add your questions in the question function now, and let's jump into it. All right, now we welcome Dolby's Greg Stryke Chin with his Pro Mix Tips. How are you, Greg?
I'm great, Ben. How are you? Great to be here, as always.
As always, sir. All right, so this is a fun one. You're going to show taking automation from the Music Panner over to Pro Tools. And the Music Panner, the Dolby Atmos Music Panner, is such a cool tool, of course, that has a feature I'm sure you're extremely happy and excited about in the step sequencer. But it also gives you increased flexibility and adds some musicality to your workflow. So with that, why don't you show us what you got?
Awesome. Thanks, Ben. Yeah, this is a real fun one. And for me in particular, when I first started getting interested in Dolby Atmos, when I found out or when I learned about the Dolby Atmos Music Panner and saw it in action, my good friend Matt Lang was showing it off. And that is the thing that hooked me. Like, this Music Panner was the thing that got me into the idea of, man, how creative can I be with in the immersive space using something like a panner, and it's incredibly creative. So really happy to be sharing this. I know this has been covered in a few other videos, across the web and stuff, but I think it's kind of an important one to kind of come back to, especially as we kind of think about creating an Atmos, and as we, really kind of delve into, from the inception of songwriting all the way through the mix, and not just the mix itself, but this Music Panner is a really incredible tool. There are some specific technical limitations where you want to make sure that you're able to capture that so that the information, the panning information, can travel along when you render your ADM. So what we're going to do today is we're going to cover that a little bit, and I'll kind of walk through. There's some prerequisites here. We assume that you're in the latest and greatest version of the tools, including the renderer, Pro Tools itself, which is the DAW we're going to be showing today. Now, the Dolby Atmos Music Panner comes with the Dolby Atmos renderer. It is Mac only, but if you're a Windows PC user, don't worry. I've got something I'm going to show just for you guys. Though you don't have access to the Music Panner, there are some really creative things that you can do, and I'll kind of point that out when we get to that point in the demo. So. Here we are. We're looking in Pro Tools. We've got the Dolby Atmos renderer in the background. So we're not leveraging the internal renderer, the internal rendering in Pro Tools. We're using our Dolby Atmos renderer, so that because the Atmos Music Panner, the Dolby Atmos Music Panner, is connected to the renderer, and you can actually see right here. It's connected to my machine, same host as the renderer. So we've got Pro Tools. I've got a really simple guitar riff here. I'll just play that back. And this is assigned to objects, the stereo object 11 and 12. So let me just quickly play that back so you can hear it. So really simple, but really cool kind of, edgish kind of guitar lick there. We've got our Music Panner, and of course we have our renderer in the background. Now, as I mentioned, this Dolby Atmos Music Panner is extremely amazing because it's so creative. The reason it's so creative is because you get to make some really amazing decisions, and you can leverage. We have a step sequencer right here at the bottom of the panner. And what's great about it is it really allows you to kind of go in and create these interesting ways of being able to move your objects. Now, I've gone ahead and I've created a couple of different examples here, a couple of steps here. So I'm leveraging, basically steps 1, 2, 3, and 4. And if I go ahead and click edit, you'll see that we've got these circles here. So as I click on each one of these steps, so step 1 is going to be this circle. I use the circle tool here that's closest to the listener. The second one goes out a little bit further, 3 even further, 4 even further. Now each one of those steps has a duration. Currently they're set to 1/2, which is an eighth note. So it's the beautiful thing about the Dolby Atmos Music Panner is that it syncs to the tempo of your session. So I'm at 120, double the heartbeat or what the heartbeat is, and great if you're doing house music. When you take a look at the actual objects here, and I have them mirroring on the x-axis, you can see that they're moving as eighth notes. It's pretty fast. I'm going to go ahead and change that. I'm going to actually click on 2, and I'm actually now selecting a half note. So it's 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2. Great. And you can also see that the in the renderer follows exactly what's happening there. So what we want to be able to do is automate this, and then because we may be exporting this as an ADM, we want that automation to be able to carry. But because the Atmos Music Panner is directly connected to the renderer, that panning information doesn't travel within Pro Tools. But there's a way we can do that. So to do that, what we want to do is we're all set up here. We want to first make sure that all of our objects, everything's correct. So we know that we're on object 11 and 12 for this example. And same thing, we've got my object here, 11 and 12 here. For the panner. We already know it works. We already see it outputting there in the renderer. And what we want to go ahead and do now is make sure that we're able to capture some automation from the step sequencer. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to click right over here on the automation tab is currently set to off, right? So what we want to do is we're going to set that to right. That's going to allow us to be able to capture that in Pro Tools. So the next step is now going to be over in Pro Tools. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this just once so I can make sure that we're capturing that correctly. So I'm going to go ahead and now make sure that the panner has all of its parameters exposed to Pro Tools to be able to capture the automation. So right up here in the automation window, I just click on that. And let me bring that into frame here. So here's our plugin automation window. Depending on what you want to do, you can specifically, like I'm only going to be working with the pan X, Y, and Zs for the left and the right. But, maybe you want to be more creative. You want to, use some of the other parameters. I'm just going to go ahead and select all of them, and I'm going to add them to our plugin automation list. That way, Pro Tools knows it's now looking and listening for all the parameters, any changes that happen, so it can then basically record them or capture them. So now in Pro Tools, now that we know that the plugin automation is set to go for everything, I'm going to go ahead on that track, on that object track, I'm going to go ahead and click here where it says read. So this allows me to change our automation mode. And I'm just going to go ahead and click write. Now, because I already know what we're going to be capturing, again, we're going to be capturing panning information X, Y, and Z axis for both left and right. I'm going to go here on the automation lane selector for that track, right down here at the bottom left of the track. And then I'm going to go ahead and select the album, the Dolby Atmos Music Panner. And again, we haven't captured anything yet, but again, I know that specifically what I'm going to be capturing is pan information. So let me start with just selecting pan X, which is going to be the left side. And then I'll just click plus. It's going to add Y, plus again, it'll add Z. I'm going to hit plus one more time, and it's just going to go down to the next automation layer that's listed. But I know that object size I'm not using right now. So I'm going to go ahead and just click that, and I'm going to go and just select pan X R. And then same thing, hit plus again. So then I'll get the Y and then the Z. So now I've got all my panning information that's going to be captured for both the left and the right side. So because I'm in write mode, I don't need to record anything. All I need to do right now is just return to 0, and I'm going to hit play, and we're going to see that automation be written. Let me go ahead and extend this down a little bit so you can see a little bit more. There we go. right, then I go ahead and stop. Now I can see that that information has been captured. What I'm going to go ahead and do now is I'm going to deactivate the Dolby Atmos Music Panner because this information is now being sent over to the built-in immersive panner in Pro Tools, Dolby Atmos Panner in Pro Tools. So now what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to go and deactivate the music panner. Now, the first thing I'm going to go and do is turn off the automation just to be safe. And then in Pro Tools, I'm going to right click on the insert where the Dolby Atmos Music Panner lives. I'm going to right click on it and make that inactive. So that music panner is no longer active. We have the panning information. What we now need to do is convert that to Pro Tools panning information. So to do that, we make sure that we've got our track selected. And then we're going to go right up here to the edit menu. And we're going to go down to automation. And we're going to go right down here to where it says duplicate Dolby Atmos plugin automation to pan automation. That's a mouthful, but that's what we're going to go ahead and do. And then we'll get a window here that pops up that's basically letting you know that copying between the Pro Tools pan and automation, this is an undoable action. So you may want to save before you do this, maybe do a backup so you can go back if need be. But we're going to go ahead and click OK. And now, there we go. If I pull up the panner here, the Pro Tools panner, we can see that the information has now transferred over to the panner, and it's doing exactly what I needed it to do. Now, there we go. Now, let's say we actually had a bunch of these duplicated. You can see that I'm actually duplicating the automation as well. In case you're not duplicating the information, you can always go to Edit. You can do a copy special, and you can copy all of the pan information, and then you can do a paste special where you basically paste everything to fill up the remainder of the track. So that's an option as well. Now, for you Windows users, I mentioned, obviously, if you don't have access, to the Dolby Atmos Music Panner, you still have the ability to be able to do some really creative panning things. So very quickly, you can see here in Pro Tools how I have my panning axes exposed. You can actually go in and write automation. So if I go ahead and delete all this information, for instance, you can actually go in and obviously you can write information using the plugin itself, the panner itself. But if you wanted to do some time-based things, obviously right now I'm in grid mode and I'm at 120 BPM. I'm currently at a bar setting. But if I go ahead and change this, let's say to quarter note, so you can see I've got more segmentation between, so I've got quarter note segmentations between the space. What I can actually do is I can actually write automation using Pro Tools pen automation. So I can choose square, and let's say I wanted to just write some information here, and you can see that this is actually doing it based on the grid. Now, if you lessen the grid, widen the grid, you can get really creative. So we've got, you've got different pen options or pencil options, line, triangle, square, random, which is actually really kind of cool. And you can do some really interesting things there. So for, if you're on Windows PC, don't worry, there's still some interesting ways that you can leverage thinking about, automating things based on tempo. And that's one way you can do that. So with that, I hope that's helpful. And we'll toss it back over to you. And I'm sure if you guys have any questions, please do feel free to add them in the chat and we'll get to them. Back over to you, Ben.
Thank you, Greg. No, that was super helpful. That was awesome. Thank you for sharing that. That's a fun one and such a cool way to give you flexibility and musicality in your mix for using the music panner, and then getting that automation over to Pro Tools to use the Pro Tools panner. So very cool workflow. Thanks for that. All right. With that, we will jump into our conversation with Nick Reeves. All right. I'm so happy to welcome back mix engineer Nick Reeves to the Music Community Sessions. And as always, Dolby's Greg, Stryke, Chin. Thank you guys for being here.
Thanks for having us, Ben.
Awesome. So please add your questions for Nick and for Greg, and we're going to get into those in just a minute. But first, let's talk about some QC best practices, Nick, and then we'll get into controlling LFE and managing loudness in just a moment. But again, welcome back to the session. And I think of you, and I think many people do, as really one of the top Dolby Atmos mix engineers working today. I'm just going to rattle off a couple of the artists that you've worked with and mixed in Atmos: Bob Marley, Billie Eilish, and Pearl Jam, to name just a few. But you're currently the director of audio engineering for UMG. And for our audience who may not know who you are just yet, though they've probably heard your mixes of those artists and seen you at events, could you start by sharing a little bit about your work and your role?
Sure, absolutely. So mix engineer, and I came up through Capitol Studios, where one of the very first collaborations between UMG and Dolby came about when it came to music and as it relates to the Dolby Atmos experience. So I was very lucky to kind of be sort of the guinea pig for what that looked like, and from building a studio that hit our targets as music makers instead of filmmakers, and what it means to have like three-dimensional audio in relationship to music. So fast forward 7, almost 8 years now, and it's been an incredible experience, going from there are no rules, it's just about the relationship between the art and the technology, and then all the way to a world where we have it in cars and cinemas and, at home and in our headphones and just all around. And, just to see that growth has been a really incredible experience. And I feel very privileged to have got that exposure early on and help build this experience that's not only great for us in the music community, but also just for fans of all types of content. And just the way that's exploded onto the scene has been something that's been really fantastic. And as you mentioned, I've had the privilege to work with a lot of pretty incredible artists along the way, whether it's sitting in studios and listening and having conversations about how it can relate to their art, or mixing records and, collaboratively side by side, or remote, or, sort of getting through the pandemic and working on the headphone experience. There's just been a lot of chapters in this story. And I just keep looking forward to, turning the page and seeing what happens next. So I'm always appreciative of everything that Dolby has done for us, and the opportunities and the communication and the collaborations that we've been able to have. And so, fast forwarding to now at my role at UMG, I continue to mix and work with our artists and work with Dolby and our other partners about, how we can continue to, explore and expand and bring that experience to everybody. And also, working with our label groups and our other mixers and other artists and creatives on how to really just continue to elevate the experience and really focus on quality and opportunity as they exist for the music that we make for our artists and the immersive Dolby Atmos experience.
Well, we too are incredibly appreciative of the collaboration and the partnership over the last 7-8 years, man. It's been a joy to work together. And one of the pieces that you've been really involved in, you touched on it a little bit, you've really been a consistent contributor and a source of really valuable feedback on the Dolby Atmos tools. So like, for example, the renderer, the album assembler, as those continue to evolve and be iterated upon. And you've helped to shape how those tools evolve really to meet the needs of the creative community. So again, huge thanks for that. The QC that you do with UMG is a multi-layered process, right? That people may not be as familiar with, but combining these two things, as you come from the creative background and have seen kind of the tools evolve and be iterated upon, you've been in your studio role, like you mentioned, and label role now. What are some of the key things Atmos engineers should be considering from a creative perspective when submitting their mixes that you're considering on the QC side of things now, kind of in the label role?
That's an excellent question. And of course, there are a lot of sophisticated nuances to it. But I think, first and foremost is that, we want to be able to support creative intention to its, as a like, the paramount operating goal for us, right? So we really want to make sure that our artists and their collaborative engineers and mix engineers have the opportunity to understand, and benefit from some of the experiences we've had as we've done these types of experiments and exposure to different consumer endpoints. So really providing a baseline of resources and if necessary experiences to enable artists to feel totally creative when it comes to how they want to express themselves in the immersive space, right? There are plenty of artists who have been with us since the beginning and, have a very forward-thinking mentality around what it means to make a record in stereo and also in Atmos and what that relationship is like, in both their creative process and also like how to create meaningful experiences. But there are also a lot of artists who, maybe just based on their timeline or based on, their sort of where they've come into making records or being on tour in relationship to the Atmos movement, still want to be able to provide for those artists opportunities to really understand what it is that's happening here and how that can relate to their craft, especially in a sense where it's not that they need to do anything to hit opportunities for the experience, but rather what does the experience offer their creativity, and then enabling in them as much as possible, the opportunity to then make an experience that is a reflection of their intention. Right. So, there's when, all of a sudden everyone's working and experimenting in this field, how do we make sure everyone has an understanding of what it is that opportunity represents for them? So first and foremost is enabling creativity and supporting and understanding, where our different artists and engineers are coming from.
And what are some of the things that you're seeing that, creatives should think about technically and specifically as they're approaching their mixes that, are maybe things that they hadn't been thinking about originally when they go into the creative process that, may become an issue for submission?
We've got some, sort of objective technical specifications, right? I mean, there's no denying that delivering in Atmos is a slightly more sophisticated delivery spec than in stereo. And I think that, a general awareness of that is really important thing. But also understanding that a lot of those guidelines are meant to improve the translation across different outputs, so, one of the things, there's the high level stuff like how do you use the space? What is object rendering? What does it mean to step outside of the bed? What opportunities or challenges exist there? A lot of that can relate to the craft, but there's also no wrong answers, right? We've heard amazing object mixes and amazing bed mixes. So it's really about what avenue is most comfortable for you to step into that space. So that's creative use of the tool set. When we get into the QC side of things, there are some things that I know we'll touch upon later today, like filtered LFE. There's a loudness spec that's integrated LUFS. These are things that, maybe historically we haven't always, thought about in terms of our stereo deliverables. And so I think when it comes to those things, there needs to be a certain understanding of why those practices exist, but also what those opportunities then represent, right? Because Atmos is such a more dynamic format, hitting target loudnesses becomes a tool for expression, right? How the flow of a record goes, what songs, feel big and what songs feel intimate, that can all relate to loudness, but isn't a direct product of it, right? So understanding that there is in fact a musical and creative, narrative that exists underneath these technical specs is really important. I think another one is the trim and down mix settings, right? The idea that direct render is a lot closer to the mix that you're hearing in the moment than low row is. But let's not just say you have to put it in direct render. Let's help people understand why that's important, because as your mix manifests itself in so many different environments, we want translation and we want consistency, right? We want to know that as I sit in this big studio and make these decisions, that those decisions will be honored even in outputs that, or endpoints that maybe have more limited resources than I have. But what's important is that the music translates. And so all of those little technical specs that we talk about that might seem abstract really are all about consistency in experience, translation across different endpoints, all to support that your musical decisions function and manifest themselves to the best to their ability in any given scenario, whether you're in a car or on a sound bar, in a theater, in a studio, all of those opportunities. It's all about translation and in supporting your creative intention.
That's great, Nick. And I really appreciate you kind of touching on the point of, the QC process and all the work that, needs to go into that from a creative perspective, with the outcome, you're really wanting to make sure that translation is there across everything. So I appreciate you kind of covering that. So there are a couple of things you mentioned pretty much everything we kind of wanted to touch on a little bit more and dive into a little bit. But before we do that, there is one thing you mentioned, which I just wanted to kind of go on, have you talk about a little bit about. So, you talked about, there being a lot of great mixes that are, specifically beds and those that are like specifically objects, obviously the combination of the two. Wondered if you could just take a quick second first to just tell us a little bit about your thought process in terms of how you approach mixing. You're very object based, and if you could just talk a little bit about that and the decisions and the thought process around that for you.
Of course, there's no wrong way to make a mix. I am all about objects all the time. And that was a practice that I adopted very early on because, for kind of multiple reasons. First and foremost, taking the most advantage of what the Atmos ecosystem has to offer, right? And objects really do give us, the greatest opportunity for discrete localization, for rendering opportunities, that idea that we're making our image is really a virtual three-dimensional mix that then scales itself as appropriate to the resources that are available to it upon playback. Objects give us the most power and opportunity for that scaling and resolution and re-rendering to exist. So first and foremost, that became clear to me. So very early on, I started just assigning all my, multi-tracks or stems directly to objects, and then using those to create the relationships that I want in the immersive space. Another thing that I think is really critical about object-based mixing, or at least an opportunity that it represents, is that, we need to make one mix that sounds great in any number of speaker combinations, but also sounds great in headphones. And so by being as high resolution as possible with objects, I get the most creative flexibility over my binaural render settings. And that can really allow me to create a soundscape that has meaning in the headphone experience, especially as it relates to the stereo experience, right? We want there to be an opportunity for that mix to have space and subtlety, right? The musical identity, of course, can remain intact in that comparison, but what opportunities do the binaural render settings give us? And that is to create depth in a way that we haven't really had the opportunity to before. The idea that I can have a dry signal and its reverb return actually have distance in the same plane or axis relative to my position is a really exciting thing. So leaning into objects for me is all about embracing what opportunities the Atmos ecosystem represents, and in my experience leads to some of the more exciting translations, especially up to theaters, but also, into the binaural space where we really can have, an opportunity to express what's possible here, right? And create that compellingly alternative experience. So that's a big part of why I like to use objects. And it also frees me a little bit more in my creativity, right? By just taking objects and moving them around the space, and not thinking about multi-channel, not thinking about those, like array relationships or any of those sorts of things. I get to just have complete access to my space. And that's something that I find really satisfying as a mixer. And also I think really unlocks more free creativity in my relationship to what I'm doing and in what ways I can best serve the music.
Yeah, appreciate that, Nick. Yeah. And I think the results speak for themselves. So, digging into some of the more technical pieces, and you kind of mentioned some of that in your lead up. So on the last community sessions, we talked a little bit about LFE management and kind of some interesting ways or other ways to kind of manage that outside of the LFE send and the pan plugin, and being able to leverage a bus and really then being able to roll off and where and when and how to do that. So wanted to maybe toss it to you and get your take on it. Your mixes, proved to be excellent in terms of representation of the original songs. Some of them, the mixes that they've come from, but also in an Atmos in an immersive environment where you have this very dynamic sense of space and everything else. You do a really amazing job of on the entire mix, but certainly managing LFE, which is super important for guys like me here in Miami.
Yeah, so well, absolutely it is, right? And as a bass player, I take low end very seriously. You know what I'm saying? But and I think for all of us, the response we get to low end is not just the appreciation of low frequency information, but it's such a straight line to emotional resonance. There's a reason that we react so well to mixes that have really great low end in them, however they're presented, right? So, and also jumping straight from stereo into Atmos, what does it mean to have LFE? Like what do we gain from that musically, but also what challenges does it present technically? And there are a few. Most notably, Atmos is a full range format, right? Atmos is a full range experience. So LFE isn't, we're not crossing over into LFE most of the time. Of course you can, and there are opportunities for that, but primarily we're seeing LFE as an ability to extend and add a low frequency response where we have dedicated resources that can optimize with that, how that feels for us, right? So we know we've got, maybe you've got a big 808 in the front, image of your mix, and you just want to be able to add a little bit more power to it, a little bit more extension to it, and utilize resources like subwoofers and LFE boxes that are optimized for that experience. So the opportunity there is immediately apparent to most of us who mix music, where low end is a key, character in the experience. So when I think about, you'd mentioned, both Bob Marley and Billie Eilish are totally different examples of music where low end is incredibly important, right? And so it's a key figure in the experience that we're listening to, whether it's coming from the organ or the bass or a synth or anything. It's really critical. So then we get into, how do we use it? What can we do? How can we ensure that it behaves in the way that not only makes the most sense, but comes back to that idea of translation, right? So we're in our studios, we have calibrated, reference values that are important. And when all of that, is levels that, variable, and we start to express ourselves creatively, what do we want to do? So, there are, speaking technically and also putting on my QC hat, it is critical and also just frankly mandatory that we filter our LFEs for deliverables, right? The native Atmos environment, whether it's an ADM or a DAMP, that information exists in the LFE channel unfiltered in its natural state, right? And we want to, for a number of reasons, filter that information, and we want to allow that opportunity to exist in the hands of the creators, right? Where is that low pass filter set? What's the slope look like? And in what ways is that managed and handled? So I'm getting into the more, in the session environment. So I work in Pro Tools. So everything I say will be relevant to Pro Tools, but so many of the concepts that we're going to explore exist in any other DAW, right? So, we know that in the multi-channel panner and Pro Tools, there is a send to LFE. And it sounds like you've covered this stuff, so I'm not going to belabor too much the introductory stuff, but there is a send to LFE, which of course functions, but in no way does that create for us a filter. It just gives us the opportunity to send full range information from our source material to the LFE as an additional output signal. That'll then route to our subs, and it'll sound great, right? So in the moment, because we have a managed B chain, you're going to hear it sound the way that you likely anticipate it sounding, that aligns with your expectations, and that's great. But there are ways where we as mixers can employ filters that can maximize not only the necessity to have a filtered LFE for our deliverable, but also what happens when we add low frequency information. What happens when we add a filter that adds parallel low frequency information to our experience? And in what ways can we influence that to yield a really positive outcome, right? So I want to share a little bit about that. And I have some visual aids because, that always helps, that have to do with alignment, right? So first and foremost, what I do is I instantiate a mono aux channel in my mix environment. On that channel, I have a filter that I use. I use FabFilter Pro Q3, a platform we are all very familiar with. And if not, check it out. It's a fantastic utility. The FabFilter Pro Q3 EQ has a lot of power and opportunity. So that's my filter of choice. And so any signal I choose to route to the LFE, which is primarily instruments that could truly benefit from that, right? Kicks, 808s, bass, synths where bass is a huge part of its information, programmatically selecting which voices or elements in the mix could benefit from low end extension, and not all of it, right? Grand pianos I may choose not to use, even though they have plenty of low frequency information, because in the context of the mix, it may not need that extension. Because like we were saying before, Atmos is a full range protocol. So there's plenty of natural, true, and functional low end happening all of the time. So where do we choose what benefits the most from the extension? And then how do we treat that? So as I'm selecting those sources and I'm sending them to my LFE aux, which is hard routed to the LFE output of the bed, it's hitting a filter. And what I do, and of course this is where some of the art comes in and the discussion comes in, but I have a, standard low pass filter at 100 hertz at 24 dB per octave. Pretty standard stuff. Maybe there'll be some situations where I might raise it. Maybe there'll be some situations where I might lower it. Those are going to be bespoke to the mix. Is it an acoustic situation? Is it a synthesized situation? Low end energy can exist in so many different ways. So, that's where I might adjust and look at what that filter is doing. But something that I want to bring to everyone's attention, or at least have the opportunity to expose you to so that you can think about this critically, is what physically happens when we filter frequencies that then get added to, right? We're not removing below 100 from that 808. We're sending it to another place to then be presented to us at the same time. And time is critical in the arrival of that information. So if you're familiar with the Pro Q, for example, but a lot of EQs offer this opportunity, we have different modes with which it can handle and process the filtering information, right? And the main three are zero latency, natural phase, and linear phase, which has degrees of settings, right? So they have a pretty notable impact on what happens to the arrival time of that information in the LFE. So what I've prepared for you is I rendered ADMs out of Pro Tools of a kick drum that's being fed to the LFE. And in each of these renderings, I changed the settings of the Pro Q. And then I brought each of those back into Pro Tools so we could look at a blown up waveform and look at what's happening with those arrival times. And so I want to share with you an example that has, 5 different opportunities for filtered LFE or unfiltered LFE. And so I'm going to do a little screen share here real quick. And just to demonstrate that time and alignment and arrival are critical when it comes to these types of filters. So I'm just going to share my screen here, and we're going to look at Pro Tools, and hopefully it doesn't scare anybody. But here we are. And what we're looking at here are 5 different filter settings or non-filter settings, and I'm going to walk us through them. But a lot of us we can already see kind of what's happening here. So in this green set, this is no filter at all, right? So everything's just full range, sent to the LFE. Arrival time is great, but we know that that's not what we want, right? We know that we can't get away with delivering an unfiltered LFE. We know we don't want that for archival purposes. It's just not what's best for, the optimal performance of our mixes. So then we get into some things where it gets a little interesting. The red, we're seeing the Pro Q3, and just for reference here, we're looking at it, right? So we're, FabFilter Pro Q, 100 hertz, 24, standard stuff. We could move this, we could sharpen or soften that Q. There's opportunity for that, but explore with that on your own. Zero latency and natural phase. Even with delay compensation engaged, we see, due to the physical product of filtering, an offset of arrival times, which ultimately leads to some confusing waveform information that will absolutely affect our sonic experience, right? Phase and arrival time is absolutely critical. And by phase, really, I should be probably saying polarity here because, strictly speaking, we're talking about the relationships of waveform arrival times. So with no filter, we're going to get everything in complete unison. That's great, but we know that won't work. So we need to move forward. Well, with zero latency, we're seeing an offset that's going to cause cancellations and combat our ability to get a succinct arrival time where I'm sitting in the room and what's coming out of the LFE and what's coming out of the mains are hitting me at the same time. And therefore my ability to perceive it is succinct and in phase or polarity locked. Where we start to see some more interesting opportunities is when we step into linear phase, and this is how I configure my LFE filter, is that I use my Pro Q in linear phase. Yeah, we get a little bit of anticipatory arrival time, but you'll notice once the sustain of the kick drum is taking place that we have a much healthier polarity relationship here. And straight up sit in your studio and toggle these things on a loop and listen with your ears because, it's great to mix with your eyes, but you will absolutely hear what's happening here, right? You will have an ability to immediately appreciate what a locked phase relationship is for a kick drum or an 808 or a bass when it comes to true low frequency information. So I just want you all to think critically about what these opportunities represent. Now, just to take it a little bit further, as some of you maybe have been exposed to, I'm sure it's been talked about in this forum before, Dolby has another utility that they offer us, which is the Dolby Atmos Album Assembler, right? Which in this is being referred to as the DAA. The newest version of that allows you to impose a filter on ADMs globally, right? From more of a mastering or tailoring process, they have provided us an opportunity to filter without having to go back upstream to a mix session. And you'll notice that filter performs a hell of a lot like our linear phase filter and provides us with a really healthy, really locked up waveform here. So if you're in a situation where maybe you're managing a project and you're getting mixers from different people, or you've already done your project and you're not sure, if the filtering took place or not, or maybe it didn't, but you don't want to go back upstream to your Atmos sessions, whatever it is, the Atmos Album Assembler gives you an opportunity to filter your LFE after the fact. You don't get, it's a in or out situation. So there's not a lot of nuance to it, but I just want to give you the opportunity to understand that under the hood, the right things are happening, and that will yield a product that is aligned in the way that will give us a healthy phase locked, polarity locked presentation of that information, such that we can, have confidence in what's going on there. So, obviously a lot of information moving fast, but I just wanted to, provide for us an opportunity to think critically about how we employ those filters. We know we need to use them and we know how to do it, but what's that 102 level thinking? Where do we get to relate to that? And how do the physics of filtering and time alignment play a factor in what's happening in our mixes and our experiences? So if you have one of those moments where you've got a big bass drop, go ahead and experiment with that and hear how it behaves in your studio. And also, allow yourself to think critically about how that behavior works. So that's kind of that's my high level, low level, in level overview of what LFE can do. And it's a critically important thing. And, it's just, we really owe it to our artists to understand how best to represent what is such a significant and critical component of any mix process and how we can relate to it.
That's fantastic, Nick. Really, thank you for that. And, I'll just say that's a perfect bookend to, again, to all of our viewers. If you go back and check out the previous community sessions where we kind of went through the setting up of that. Nick just provided a masterclass on taking that further and really, how you can really consider, leveraging the LFE and what to look for, what to listen for rather. And that was excellent. Thank you so much, Nick. Just a quick reminder, if you've got questions, please make sure you're throwing them up in the chat and we'll make sure we get to them as quickly as we can. I will do some Q&A here after. So Nick, moving on to the next piece, one of the most common questions, Ben and I and the rest of the team, we all get in the field really has to do with the idea of perceived loudness when someone's kind of approaching a mix. Maybe they've done the stereo mix themselves or, it's been done. And now they've got the creative task of creating this Dolby Atmos deliverable for that version. And, there's the management, there's the recommendations that we make around True Peak and around LUFS or LKFS. And a lot of times we get questions around, I understand what the recommendation is. I understand, for better or worse, why that is, or, why that's been, put in as a best practice and a recommendation. But they, some folks might still have, I wouldn't say struggle, but certainly there's an issue in the perceived loudness between the two. How do you approach that? How do you approach making sure that you've got enough punch, you've got enough dynamic range, you've got all of the good things, all of the good creative things that need to happen audibly for the listener, thinking about True Peak and thinking about LKFS.
Absolutely, and it is at sometimes completely effortless to hit those targets, and sometimes it is just a radical, I'm pulling my hair out challenge to really get to where I want to be. So understand that is a natural part of the process, but we gain so much from that, right? Like I was saying about ensuring that everyone that we work with has an understanding of why we do these things. Atmos is fundamentally more dynamic it offers us that opportunity when compared to stereo, right? Now, obviously that's a choice, but we have these sort of standards and practices, right? And so in order to make that function, we've had to set these, deliverable specs that offer us an opportunity for everything to perform at its best. And so that, of course, is not to exceed an integrated loudness of minus 18.0 and not to exceed a true peak value of -1. -2 is better, but -1 is, where that hard ceiling, needs to exist in order for us to ensure that these mixes will perform in the way that they're meant to. So knowing that that's true, what do we do? Well, first of all, we make our mix, right? And let it be dynamic, right? We love those intimate verses and those bombastic choruses. We love when that guitar solo like just jumps out at us, that like things feel loud and things feel intimate and things have texture and depth and dynamics, right? So first and foremost is enjoy what the format has to offer, what the experience of immersive music has to offer, and make your mix as dynamic as you want it to be. Then when we get into understanding how that relates to these loudnesses is where we start to kind of get into those nuances between, what's best for my project and how does loudness really work, right? So, one example that I give sometimes about the way integrated loudness, actually works is that balance between measurable loudness and perceived loudness, right? So a singer with an acoustic guitar at -18 is going to be so much louder in perception than a metal band at -18 because of the density and the amount of information and the negative space and everything that's going on there. In the same way that an orchestral piece will be very dynamic, but also have this continuous legato phrasing, and that'll behave a lot differently than like an EDM piece where you've got a lot of really high energy information, but also a ton of negative space, right? If you think about how much time in a 3-minute electro track there actually isn't sound, it's surprisingly a lot, right? So all of those factors lead us to how different material and different mix presentations will perform differently with these integrated LUFs. So let's talk a little bit about how I actually deal with it, right? First and foremost, if I'm doing a single where it's just one track, I'll shoot for that 18-1 relationship as best I can for the product. When we look at a record or an EP or multiple pieces that are meant to exist together as a single experience, that's where a little bit more nuance comes into play, right? That's where we want, to flow through the songs and not feel that they jump or dip in volume, but all feel appropriately loud in reference to each other, right? So that's where that, those two, metal tracks and then the acoustic break in the middle, those are going to come in at very different LUF levels in order for me to perceive it as a nice and smooth, experience, right? So one of the, there are a couple different things we can do to prepare ourselves for that. One thing that we can do, and this is a technique that a colleague of mine, Adam Leffler, exposed me to, which is looking at all of the stereos and getting measurements for them, not to know how loud they are, but where those relative differences exist, right? If track 1 is -7.8 and track 2 is -9, now I can get a little bit of a delta of LUFS relationships that maybe if I reproduce in my Atmos experiment will start me off somewhere meaningful, right? So if you're dealing with what is, a very dynamic record, then that might be a good place to start to help understand where these levels are going to perform. And then ultimately, when we get to a place where you're looking at your whole record, where are my loudest or most energetic or most banner pieces? And then where do those, maybe those are 18, and then where does everything else fall in relationship to that so that we have a continuity of experience? That's one way to manage, how to understand how loud a individual track should be, right? Now, when we get into actually making that track hit those loudnesses, that's where you get kind of a combination of experiences. If you're mixing from stereo stems, you've got a little bit more, it's likely you have a little bit more control over that because those stems are all balanced already in relationship to each other. When you're mixing from multi-tracks, and again, the Bob Marley is a good example of this, really big kick hits and really big side stick snare hits, big bass drops, the different guitars, that have a very kind of staccato presentation, they can yield these really loud peaks, but also have all of this negative space. So then you start running into this era where, well, I'm getting, true peak is 0, but I'm at -20. So how do I reconcile these things? There are a couple of different opportunities. Of course, there's your mix techniques, right? Creating blends, dynamic compression, things specific to the voices in your mix that can be applied to kind of control some of those things, but without being as audible. We can also look at, and I bring up again the album assembler. That opportunity, there's a limiter in that platform that can look, it's an actual true peak limiter. So while you got to play a little push and pull games to get that relationship between that integrated loudness and the true peak to make sense, there's an opportunity where you can look at your whole mix and create some control and create some, protection against maybe those big dynamic spikes, or, those intimate valleys where things maybe get a little bit quieter. So there are a couple of different ways we can approach how to manage that in a specific mix. And then there's a couple different ways we can approach how to manage that when your project, requires different LUFS values, right? As long as you're not breaking that rule of 18 and 1, you can pretty much do anything you need to do in order for your musical experience to make the most sense, right? And there are some ways in which, consumer deliverable services and streaming services help protect us against some of those deltas. But we let them worry about that. What we're worrying about is that what our deliverable sounds like and how that represents the intention of the experience, right? So that when we hit that acoustic track in the middle of a really bombastic record, it doesn't jump out at us as being way louder, even though they're all hitting 18, right? That one can come in at 20. And when we're sitting there listening to it, you don't perceive that there's a loudness difference. You just perceive the energy difference in the way that the music is meant to reflect, right? So, no doubt loudnesses can be a challenge to manage, but there are a lot of resources and opportunities and understandings that can help us, get to a place where, we can present our music in the way that it's meant to be heard.
Wow. Nick, thank you so much for sharing that insight, man. I mean, it is always a real lesson sitting with you in not only the how, but really exploring so much of the why things behave the way they do in the Atmos environment, and how we can gain, like a real understanding of the tools with intent in specific situations for different genres, and with a really educated approach to do what you just said, ensure that translation and really do what's best for the music and for the mix, man. So thank you so much for sharing that. I'm sure we have a lot of questions, so we'll jump into that now. And I'll just quickly mention that we're using a new platform for receiving questions. Please add your name with your question so we can address you personally. And with that, we'll jump over to questions.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back, Nick.
All right.
Welcome back, everybody. Wow, that was great. All right. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions, and we got a lot of excellent questions. We answered some directly back to the asker during the questions, and we'll try to go a few minutes past the top of the hour here to answer as many as we can. And if we can't, we'll try to get back to you via email if we run out of time. So jumping right in, Nick, for you, Jose asks, when managing loudness, how much transient peak control do you tend to use in most cases? And how do you manage that within the multi-channel flow, beds, object beds, etc.?
One of the things I love about Atmos, especially as it kind of compares to other experiences, is its dynamic range. So if I can basically get away with leaving things as kind of, hard hitting or as peak oriented as possible, I like to enjoy that. There are, of course, sometimes, especially when you're working from like raw multi-tracks, where, that might go against the kind of the creative perspective that you're trying to achieve, or create issues with loudness where you've got true peaks that are going way above, and then, your integrated is really low. Under those circumstances, I might employ some limiting, or I might employ some compression to work with either at the specific sounds or the mix as a whole, depending on where and how that challenge exists for me. But my first choice is to not have to do that and enjoy the kind of the slightly more dynamic performance that we get, because I'm never trying to like beat stereo. I'm trying to create something that has a compellingly alternative experience. And so under those circumstances, I think dynamic range and peak performance is an opportunity that Atmos provides for us to create that alternative experience. And so whenever possible, I try to preserve that energy in the way that it was performed by the musicians or sequenced by the producers.
Awesome. Thank you. Moving right along, another one for you, Nick, and maybe you can just touch a couple of bullet points because this is probably a big one. But Kareem asks, what does your approval workflow look like in Atmos? What are the biggest challenges?
I would say, first and foremost, of course, the approval is if I weren't already sitting in the room with the artist, is to get the artist in the room with me, or to ensure that they can hear the mixes in a proper environment. I would think, that of course is, I think, necessary to get anything, produced and published with true creative authority. And then when it comes to the challenge, it's, maybe getting them in the room. I mean, I'm here in Los Angeles, so I definitely get maybe more access to not only rooms but to the artists than maybe some people do, but realistically it's all about ensuring that to truly understand what it is that we're doing, especially if it's the first time an artist has worked in Atmos, to sit in a proper space so that you understand what's going on with it, and then also secondarily to provide for them a maybe more real world expression of that. And to do so, most of the studios I work in have lounges with like sound bars, or we have access to cars that have this experience. And so just to take that, okay, here's the studio where you really get to put a magnifier up to what it is that we're creating here, and then here's like a user endpoint that can give you an understanding of what someone in the more day-to-day experience is going to have. So those are critical opportunities. We don't always have the time to do that, and sometimes you work with artists who I've maybe worked with them before, and so then I have their confidence. That's of course an extreme luxury, in which case I can sort of work knowing that they are going to approve that what it is that I create. But for most, it's really about nothing beats sitting side by side with the artist or the producer and listening to the experience in a proper space, and exploring that, and then of course I would also say, going into any project, have at least a touch-based conversation about what their expectations are. Do you want this to be a big, massively immersive experience that really takes advantage of what that opportunity presents? Or do you want it to be a little bit more kind of true to the stereo experience, such that delta is a little bit more narrow, but also that it compellingly exists in the format, right? Like, what are the artistic expectations, so that you can go into the project knowing that you have that kind of creative overview in mind?
Awesome. Thank you. From Ruby, in a case where you have mixed stems, but the master was doing a lot, what techniques are you using to match the overall energy of the master? And a follow-up to that, she asks, anything you might try other than compression alone? And in this case, there's room for the LUFs to go up. Nick or Greg?
Well, certainly happy to speak to that on my account. There are kind of a variety, depending on what those deltas look like, and if I have any insight into the mastering process itself, like, is this a legacy tune or is this a contemporary tune? I might employ different things. I'm a big fan of parallel compression to create a little bit more interactivity amongst the the different elements, because as I probably mentioned in the thing, I'm very object oriented. So I might have stems or multis all over the place. And then I want to create a glue factor, and I find that parallel does a really good job of that, especially with a little bit of harmonic interaction as well. So that's one place I would do it. And I'm also not afraid to like link an EQ across everything to do a little bit more upstream processing, if it's something where there's a really radical timbral shift that's taking place there. So those are some ways I'll address that. And then when it comes to looking at a whole record, maybe where it's like the individual songs came from different producers or were recorded in different studios, then I might employ a more kind of global process, like using the Dolby Atmos assembler, the album assembler, in which case I can apply EQs or dynamic control over all of the ADMs to create a sort of more of a continuity there. That also helps sometimes when assembling records where even the Atmos mixes may have been done by different people, right? Or had to be done by different types of sources, some multi-track, some stems. So under those circumstances, I find to kind of take a more, not traditional mastering approach, but an approach that utilizes some of what has been so successful about why mastering is a great process, right? Those are some different ways where we can create album identity and continuity when it's a timbral thing. But then when it comes to mixing, like I said, I like a lot of parallel stuff, and I'm not afraid to, process or affect those stems in order to hit that kind of translation.
Great, thanks. And hopefully that answers Bobak's question about mixed bus processing, but if not, let us know and we'll follow up as well. A question from Oscar, and this is Obi, a friend of ours who went through the Music Accelerator program. Yeah. I've been considering using an object bed with the exception of channel 4, the LFE. Can you discuss common practices while implementing and or things to look out for while working this way, Nick?
Totally. So, I probably because I started working in Atmos, in so much of the early days, I really ingrained in myself to just use the default input configuration of the renderer. So I always leave a 10-channel bed, even though I don't use it other than the LFE. And then, I have my object bed, and then of course discrete object assignments, right? And so, everything I discussed about routing to an aux for the LFE, And then also, really leaning into delay compensation, really trusting that delay compensation is taking care of whatever processing is taking place there. But so generally, I have found that it works well for me to just leave that 10 channel bed intact. Channel 4 is populated by the LFE content, and then everything else is just my objects. And in Pro Tools, using delay compensation and the linear phase EQ, everything just kind of lines up and exists in the printed master in the way that that aligns with my kind of creative perspective. So that has always been something safe for me. I've never run out of objects, so I don't, by making that 10 channel bed smaller, I've never needed to gain more resources, and I just find that it allows that use default option to help me out if I because I'm always bouncing around different studios, and I want to be able to as little as possible create like a specific input configuration that could cause challenges for me. But I have a lot of colleagues who do use specific input configurations, and they now there's a lot of two-way communication between the DAW and the renderer, or if it's an external or an internal renderer. That communication has gotten a lot healthier in recent iterations. So feel free to do whatever works best for you. But for me, I've always just felt comfortable using the default input configuration and just making sure my Pro Tools environment is operating in the way that I expect.
Awesome. Thanks, Nick. All right, Greg, over to you for a couple. Winston asks, how can I mix and render spatial surround sound in an MP3 format? And a follow-up to that, does Dolby Atmos support the Reaper DAW?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for that. For those questions, Winston. So first on mixing and rendering, Dolby Atmos, as you're working in that format in whatever DAW you're using, you are basically rendering an ADM, a BWF ADM file. There's a whole container that has all the metadata for all the objects, the beds, everything else, plus the audio itself. Getting down to a format for, let's say, for the DSP for streaming, that is going to be an MP4. So the way to do that is obviously you create your mix as you would, render it out as an ADM. If you need to convert that, very simple. You can just load the ADM right back into the renderer and then export it in the Dolby Atmos renderer and export that as an MP4. That's a really quick and dirty, or not quick way to do that. And that's exactly what you would do there. You can change the bit rate a little bit, but MP4 is going to be the format for a lower sized streamable audio file for Dolby Atmos. Now, in terms of Reaper, so most DAWs, so long as they're able to connect to the renderer and then basically be able to have Panner access, the Dolby Atmos Music Panner access, and the Dolby Audio Bridge, you should be good to go. So with Reaper, your mileage may vary. Reaper doesn't have any specific internal rendering available. It doesn't have native panning support. However, we do know that it can connect to the renderer and leverage the Dolby Audio Bridge and the panner. So you can definitely certainly try that out. There's Reaper features enough channels to be able to do what you need to do. So I know on the web there are certainly on some of the Reaper forums and such folks that are successfully doing this. So I would certainly start there.
Great, thanks. Another one for you, Greg, from Norman. How do you ensure the loudness standards are met using the Dolby renderer via headphones?
So it's pretty much just a very simple monitoring, just going back and forth, and also making sure you're using your ears. But the visual representation in the GUI on the renderer gives you exactly the information that you're going to need in terms of hitting your LUFS and your true peak. So it's just basically making sure, and certainly if you want to render an MP4 or render an ADM or record an ADM and then play those back, the binaural version of that, absolutely, using the visual aid in the GUI and also using your ears. It's as simple as that, pretty much.
Great, thanks. Greg, Sean asks, does the LFE make its way into the stereo fold down, or is it discretely only in the .1?
Yeah, it's in the .1. The LFE does not make its way into the stereo file. It does make its way into the binaural, however.
Great, thanks. Nick and Greg, I'm going to combine a couple of binaural questions into one here, and you guys can fire away. Anastasia and David ask, do you have any tips or tricks for mixing in binaural, specifically for predicting how certain choices will translate into a speaker setup? And David's question is, can you, maybe more for Nick, go over your routing setup and how you like to render your binaural mix?
Sure. So, I'm a big proponent, and I think I've talked about this a little bit on a previous community session, which is that, like, since objects all have the same potential, they're like channels on a large desk. You can use them in whatever way you want. So I create a binaural template, if you will, where all of my objects are kind of pre-assigned to banks of off, near, mid, and far. And so that way, as I instantiate an object selection for a particular sound, instrument, or voice, in that moment, I'm actually thinking about create a binaural decision. So like if I'm in speakers, I'm already mixing in binaural by thinking about those decisions. If I'm in headphones, I immediately get the feedback of what that binaural rendering decision is how that's performing with that sound, especially as I move it throughout the space. And of course, you could do the most sophisticated panning automation and then later change what those object assignments are, such that, if you decide that, maybe it shouldn't have been mid and I'd rather have it on near or something of that nature. So that's a place where I set myself up to put as little technical back and forth between me and the creativity. I find that really helps create a more organic kind of cadence to my decision making. The other component to that is, to ask about like how to anticipate performance in speakers. One, nothing beats experience. So, as much of, doing that, making mixes in binaural in headphones and then listening to how that performs in speakers and understanding what that translation sounds like is a really key experience then. And nothing is better than just doing that as much as possible. One thing I will say, it's sometimes, especially in more dense and complex mixes, it can get a little difficult in binaural to hear negative space. So one thing that can happen is, you've kind of spread everything around in a way that like kind of suits your intention. And then when you get into speakers, sometimes it can be surprising how far apart those decisions sort of feel. So getting a sort of a sense of, what that negative space, how that's performing, either to your advantage or your disadvantage, because negative space in Atmos is an incredibly powerful tool. It is something that where that performance is something that you'll want to like kind of get a little bit more of a sort of instinct as to how that behaves. Another thing is, talking about off, rendering to off is a pretty nice opportunity, because then you can make any type of, localization decision that performance in speakers, but then doesn't perform that way in headphones. So, you get to that behind your eyes stereo feel. So things where the binaural space is working against the tonality of your instrument is where off can become powerful. So like a good example I like to use for that is, hi-hats in a trap tune or bone dry by design. And so by rendering them to near, mid, or far, you're not adding a certain reverberance that is now making them no longer their creative identity. So off can preserve that decision making while also allowing you to pan them somewhere unique within the space for for the speaker playback decision. Like I like to elevate them because of their high frequency and their high energy, but then by leaving them off, can it maintain their integrity in the binaural space, right? And then, things like far, it's fun to use that to create depth within a singular plane. Like I think I mentioned this in the thing, but having a dry signal be near and a reverb return be far, you can have it located in the same sort of XYZ axis, but now you've created depth. So there are ways in which that creativity can be explored, but that won't create a different, once you get into speakers, you still have that localization of that reverb return versus that dry signal that is just existing in the same XYZ plane. So some things like that can offer some fun ways to interact with it. And again, the binaural template can just make it less of a clicking through menus situation and more of a just like assigning and moving and being organic and just keeping things as creative as possible.
Great, thanks. Okay, time for one more and we'll hit it quick. A loudness question from Eric, and hopefully that answered Ninad's question as well on binaural. But considering the negative 18 target level in Atmos, what would be the best Atmos mix level when sending out to a mastering engineer, Nick?
Oh, I mean, I think, as long as it's not louder than that, you're probably in pretty good shape. When I think about stereo, I always like to, I work with mastering engineers in stereo that I really trust their, we have that relationship where I really trust their intuition. So I like to leave some headroom for them to then use in whatever way they feel is best. And so that might be something that I would explore in Atmos. I don't typically send my mixes to another mastering engineer for Atmos. So this is just speaking from my personal experience with stereo. And if I were to receive things from mixers in that way, maybe a little bit of room would help, just because then I know that I can move a little bit more in either direction. Because like I said in the piece, not everything's going to be 18. It's just that I'm not going to exceed 18 at any moment, right? I can't, but also don't want to. So, as I create the ebb and flow of the album experience, it's going to be about which things hit 18 and which things come under that for that experience to feel smooth and continuous. So I guess, if having to think critically about that, I would err on the side of, slightly under 18, 18.5, 19, something like that, so that the mastering engineer then has as much opportunity to work with that as possible.
Wonderful. Thank you. And with that, we'll wrap this session. Many, many thanks to Nick Reeves and Greg Stryke Chin, as always. Thank you, everyone, for attending. See you next time.
Thanks all. Thanks, Nick. Cheers.